The Carrington House stood at the end of Cold Hollow Road, its shadow long and ominous in the late October twilight. The wind whipped through the bare trees surrounding the mansion, their skeletal branches scraping against the house like bony fingers. Even from a distance, the house seemed alive, its presence menacing, as though it had been waiting for something or someone for a long time. Sarah Belmont's stomach churned as she stood in front of the wrought iron gate, a twisted vine of rust and age holding it shut. She had heard the rumors about Carrington House all her life. It was the kind of place people in town talked about in hushed tones, sharing ghost stories about the strange happenings inside, whispers that haunted the air, shadows that slithered across the walls. It wasn't just a haunted house, they said. It was cursed. Yet here she was, drawn to it against her better judgment. She held the cold brass key that had arrived in her mailbox a week ago, with no return address and no explanation. She hadn't told anyone about it, not even her best friend Clara, who would have called her crazy for even thinking about coming to this place. But the key was like a magnet, pulling her closer to the house with an inexplicable force. As the gate groaned open, Sarah felt a shiver crawl up her spine. The path leading to the front door was overgrown with weeds, the stones cracked and uneven. Her boots crunched against the gravel as she made her way to the entrance, the house looming above her like a giant watching her every move. The wind howled through the trees again, and for a moment she thought she heard something else carried on the breeze. Voices, faint and distant, like the murmurs of a crowd just beyond her hearing. She stopped at the foot of the porch steps, her hand tightening around the key. "It's just a house," she whispered to herself, but even as she said it, she didn't believe it. The Carrington House had a reputation that stretched back decades. The stories told of disappearances, strange deaths, and visitors who left the place only to be plagued by nightmares for the rest of their lives. People said that the house fed on fear, that it was a living entity, more than just a collection of rotting wood and stone. Still, Sarah pressed on. She had always prided herself on being a skeptic, never believing in the supernatural. But as she climbed the porch steps, each one creaking under her weight, she couldn't shake the feeling that something inside the house was watching her. The front door was massive, its wood dark and weathered by time. The key slid into the lock with a smoothness that surprised her, as if it had been used recently. With a deep breath, Sarah turned the key. The lock clicked and the door creaked open, releasing a breath of musty, stale air. The interior was swathed in darkness, thick and suffocating. Sarah clicked on her flashlight, the beam cutting through the gloom, revealing a grand foyer that had long since fallen into decay. The once opulent staircase at the center of the room was draped in dust and cobwebs, the wallpaper peeling in long, jagged strips. Broken furniture lay scattered around the room, forgotten relics of a time when the house was alive with people. But now it felt abandoned, except for the faintest whisper that brushed against her ears. She froze, heart hammering in her chest. The whisper was soft, almost too quiet to hear, like someone murmuring just beyond the range of understanding. It came from the walls, from the floors, from every dark corner of the room. Sarah swallowed hard and stepped inside. Her boots echoed on the hardwood floor, the sound unnaturally loud in the silence. As she moved deeper into the house, the whispers grew louder, curling around her like invisible fingers, brushing against the nape of her neck. She swept her flashlight across the room, the beam catching something in the far corner, a shape barely perceptible, moving in the shadows. She blinked, and it was gone, The air around her felt thick, heavy, as if the house itself was pressing down on her. "It's just your imagination," she told herself. But the whispers disagreed. They grew more insistent, words forming in a language she couldn't understand, but the tone unmistakable. Urgent, pleading. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling slightly. She winced at the sound of it. Too loud, too real in this haunted silence. No answer came, but the temperature dropped sharply. Her breath formed small clouds in front of her, the chill biting into her skin. Suddenly, the front door slammed shut behind her with a deafening thud. Sarah spun around, her flashlight beam shaking wildly across the walls. The whispering stopped, leaving a silence that was more unnerving than the sounds had been. She tried the door, but it wouldn't budge, as though the house had locked her in. A loud creak echoed through the foyer, followed by the sound of footsteps coming from the second floor. Slow, deliberate footsteps pacing above her head. Her heart pounded in her chest as she shone her light up the staircase, expecting to see someone, or something, peering down at her from the landing. But there was nothing. The footsteps stopped abruptly. The house fell silent again, save for the sound of her own rapid breathing. Sarah backed away from the stairs, her pulse racing. The key burned in her pocket, and she suddenly wished she had never laid eyes on it. Something was wrong here, terribly wrong. She needed to leave, to get out of this cursed house. But as she turned toward the door, the whispers returned, louder this time, insistent. The house didn't want her to leave. And then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw it. A dark figure standing at the top of the stairs, barely more than a silhouette. It was watching her, silent and still. Her breath hitched, and before she could scream, the lights flickered, the darkness swallowing her whole. Carrington House had found its prey. In that instant, Sarah realized she was not alone. The house was alive, and she was its newest victim. The darkness inside Carrington House wasn't just an absence of light. It was something tangible, something alive. Sarah felt it as soon as the house swallowed her in its suffocating blackness. Her flashlight flickered, sputtering in the damp air, before the bulb finally gave out with a soft, pitiful crack. She stood frozen at the base of the grand staircase, her breath coming in short, shallow bursts. The silence pressed in on her like a physical weight. But she wasn't alone. In the oppressive quiet, Sarah became aware of something else. At first, it was just the faintest shift of air, like a breeze brushing against her skin. But there were no open windows, no drafts. Then she heard it, a low, raspy sound that made her stomach turn. It was breathing, but not hers. It came from the shadows, deep and hollow, as though something was pulling in air through lungs that hadn't breathed in centuries. She turned in place, eyes wide, straining to see beyond the veil of darkness. But there was nothing, just the sense of being watched, no, hunted. A creak sounded from the second floor, slow and deliberate, as though someone or something was pacing above her. Sarah swallowed hard, her throat tight with fear. The air in the house had grown colder, and the silence between each breath stretched unbearably long, as if time itself was warping around her. Get out, she thought. Just get out. But where could she go? The door had slammed shut behind her, and the house had locked her in. She fumbled for her phone, hands shaking, desperate to use its screen for light. The glow illuminated her face, casting long, distorted shadows against the walls. The whispers started again, but now they were clearer, closer. Words she still couldn't understand, but their tone unmistakable. Mocking, taunting. Sarah. Her name, whispered softly from the darkness. Her phone buzzed suddenly, a sharp jolt of sound in the eerie quiet. A notification. Sarah glanced down at the screen, confused. The message was from an unknown number. "Don't move. They can see you." Her blood ran cold, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. Slowly, she lifted her gaze from the screen, and that's when she saw them. Shadows just out of reach of her phone's light, shifting along the walls. They moved like smoke, but there was something solid beneath them, something more than just tricks of light. They were not natural shadows. They had depth, substance, and they were moving closer. Her heart pounded against her ribs as she took a step back, the shadows flickering and bending, creeping toward her like living things. Her mind raced. This couldn't be happening. Shadows didn't move like that. They didn't watch, didn't breathe. But these did. Another message buzzed on her phone. Run. She didn't need to be told twice. Sarah bolted down the hall, her footsteps echoing like gunshots in the eerie silence. She could feel the shadows following, chasing her, their movement more like gliding than running. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she raced down corridor after corridor, but the house seemed to twist and warp around her. The hallways looped back on themselves, doors led to nowhere, and the shadows were always there, waiting, watching. The whispers followed her, growing louder, more insistent. They tugged at her mind, filling her head with dread, making it harder to think, harder to remember why she had come here in the first place. Fear clouded her thoughts. The house was toying with her, bending reality to its will, twisting the very architecture of the place. No matter where she turned, she ended up back at the grand foyer, the staircase looming over her like a dark sentinel. Her phone buzzed again. Look behind you. Her heart stopped. She didn't want to turn, didn't want to see what was there, but her body moved before her mind could catch up. Slowly, she turned her head, the beam of her phone casting a dim glow behind her. A figure stood at the far end of the hallway, barely visible in the faint light. It was tall, unnaturally tall, with limbs too long for a human. Its body was cloaked in shadow, but its eyes, black and hollow, locked onto hers. It didn't move, didn't speak, but its presence was overwhelming, suffocating. The breath caught in Sarah's throat. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but she couldn't move. The figure was watching her with a patience that felt ancient, as though it had waited lifetimes for her to stumble into its trap. Then, without warning, it took a step forward. That was all it took to snap her back into motion. Sarah turned and sprinted, her pulse pounding in her ears, her lungs burning as she tore through the house. The whispers surged, their voices louder now, echoing through the hallways. She could feel the figure behind her, feel its gaze boring into her back, but she didn't dare look again. Up ahead, a door stood ajar, a faint light spilling out into the hallway. It was the only break in the endless darkness. Desperate, Sarah lunged for it, throwing herself inside and slamming the door behind her. She collapsed against the wall, gasping for breath, her whole body trembling with fear. The room was small, cramped, and suffocatingly dim, but it was a reprieve from the oppressive darkness outside. There was a single window, its glass dirty and cracked, letting in the faintest sliver of moonlight. Dust particles danced in the air, disturbed by her frantic movements. For a moment there was silence. No whispers, no footsteps, no breathing. Sarah let out a shaky breath, her heart still hammering in her chest. She slid down the wall, her legs weak, and dropped her phone onto the floor beside her. The screen blinked off, leaving her in near total darkness, save for the pale glow from the window. But then, the room shifted. The shadows in the corners seemed to ripple, as if they were alive, breathing with her. Her relief was short-lived. The air grew colder, more stifling, as the shadows began to move again, crawling toward her, creeping across the floor, the walls, the ceiling. They moved with purpose, converging on her, tightening their grip on the room. The whispers returned, louder than ever, filling her head with a cacophony of voices. But this time, she understood them. He's here. The window shattered, and the cold, hollow breath of the house wrapped around her, pulling her back into the darkness. Outside, the Carrington house stood as it always had, silent and imposing under the pale Halloween moon. But inside, the shadows shifted, breathed, and whispered, waiting for their next victim. The air in the basement of Carrington House was thick with the stench of rot, and something far worse, something old, damp, and decayed, like the house had soaked up centuries of death and sorrow. Sarah stood at the top of the narrow stairway, peering down into the void below. The flashlight in her hand was dead, leaving only the dim glow of her phone to illuminate the steps descending into the darkness. There was no reason for her to go down there, no reason at all. Every instinct screamed at her to turn around, to find a way out of this cursed house, to forget she had ever come. But something called to her from the depths of the basement, something impossible to ignore. It wasn't the same malevolent presence she had felt upstairs. This was different. It was quieter, more insidious. A soft, fragile voice that tugged at her soul with the faintest plea. "Help me." It came again, barely louder than a breath, echoing up from below. Sarah's throat tightened. She didn't want to go down there, didn't want to follow that voice into the suffocating dark, but she couldn't stop herself. The stairs creaked beneath her weight as she descended, the sounds sharp and accusing in the oppressive silence. The air grew colder, more stifling, the deeper she went. It felt like she was walking into a tomb, a place long forgotten by the world above. The voice was louder now, but still soft, barely more than a whisper. "Please, help me." She reached the bottom of the stairs and found herself in a small, claustrophobic room. The walls were made of rough stone, the ceiling low enough to make her feel like she was being crushed. The light from her phone barely cut through the thick gloom, but in the far corner of the room, something moved. Sarah squinted, trying to make out the shape. It was small, huddled in the corner, shivering. A child, a little girl no more than 6 or 7 years old, her knees pulled up to her chest, her long black hair hanging in a tangled curtain over her face. Sarah's heart lurched. "Oh my God," she whispered, stepping closer. "Hey, are you okay? What are you doing down here?" The girl didn't move, didn't respond. She just sat there, her small frame trembling in the cold. Sarah hesitated for a moment, then crouched down, trying to make her voice as gentle as possible. "It's okay. I'm not going to hurt you. I'm here to help. What's your name?" The girl's head slowly lifted, and Sarah sucked in a breath. The child's face was pale, too pale. Her skin was almost gray, like she had been drained of life. But it was her eyes that sent a bolt of fear through Sarah's chest. They were wide black pits, voids of emotion, empty and hollow. The girl didn't answer the question. Instead, she leaned forward slightly and whispered, "You shouldn't be here." Sarah felt a chill slither down her spine, and the room seemed to darken further, the cold becoming unbearable. She backed away, her heart pounding in her chest. "What? What do you mean?" The girl's mouth twisted into a grotesque smile, one that didn't reach her lifeless eyes. "They don't want you to leave." Before Sarah could react, the little girl's body jerked unnaturally, her head snapping back as if an invisible force had yanked her by the hair. Her limbs twisted in ways that were wrong, broken like a marionette in the hands of a cruel puppeteer. And then she spoke again, but this time it wasn't a plea for help. It was a voice that echoed from the walls, layered with something ancient, something filled with malice. "You came too close. Now you're part of it." The lights on her phone flickered violently as the shadows in the corners of the basement came alive, writhing and stretching toward her. The temperature in the room plummeted, and the walls seemed to close in, the stone groaning under the weight of an unseen force. Panic gripped Sarah, and she turned to flee, but the door at the top of the stairs slammed shut with a thunderous bang. She was trapped. Her breath quickened, her pulse pounding in her ears. The little girl's voice echoed again, but now it was more sinister, like 1,000 voices speaking in unison, distorted and grotesque. "You can't run. You belong to the house now." Sarah scrambled back, her mind racing. Her body was trembling, her legs barely holding her upright. The shadows stretched closer, and as she frantically swung her phone's light around the room, she saw them. Figures moving in the dark, just out of reach, their shapes contorted, inhuman. The whispering voices grew louder, filling her head, pressing against her sanity. "Please," she begged, her voice breaking. "Please, just let me go." The little girl stood now, her head tilting unnaturally to one side. Her black eyes locked onto Sarah's, and she smiled again, a terrible, soulless grin. "They don't let anyone go." Suddenly, the shadows surged forward, and Sarah screamed, her body instinctively trying to pull away as something cold and solid wrapped around her ankle. It was like ice seeping into her skin, pulling her down. She kicked frantically, but the grip tightened, yanking her toward the center of the room where the darkness was thickest. The ground beneath her began to crumble, the floorboards rotting away into black sludge that clung to her legs, pulling her deeper. She clawed at the stone floor, trying to find something to hold on to, but her hands only scraped against the cold, unforgiving surface. The whispers turned into laughter, cruel, mocking. The little girl's voice rose above the cacophony, a sing-song mockery of innocence. "You'll stay here forever, like the others." Sarah's body sank deeper into the floor, the icy hands of the shadows pulling her down. Her legs were submerged now, her chest barely above the surface. She screamed again, but the sound was swallowed by the darkness. The house was consuming her, pulling her into its depths, where it kept all the others who had wandered too far. With a final, desperate burst of energy, Sarah reached for her phone, her fingers shaking as she dialed the only number she could think of. Clara's. The line rang once, twice. Then it went silent. Just as the darkness reached her throat, the phone buzzed in her hand. A text. The words on the screen were short, cold. "There's no escape." The phone slipped from her fingers as the black sludge rose over her face, filling her mouth, her nose, drowning her in the silence of Carrington House. The last thing Sarah saw before she was pulled under completely was the little girl's twisted smile, her dark eyes gleaming in the dim light. The basement grew quiet again, the shadows retreating back into the walls. The little girl sat back down in the corner, her head bowed, waiting for the next visitor. The Carrington house stood silent in the fading twilight, its windows dark, its walls breathing in the stillness of the night. But inside, something far darker stirred. The house had claimed another soul. The air was thick with it, saturated with the agony of lives lost, of spirits consumed by the malignant force that lived within its walls. Sarah was gone. Her screams had long since faded, swallowed by the endless corridors, the twisting rooms that shifted and reshaped themselves as though the house were alive. And in a way it was, alive with the souls it had stolen, the memories it devoured, the fear it feasted on. But Carrington House had not always been this way. It was once a place of grandeur, of laughter and life. Before the curse, before the darkness took root, before it became a thing of nightmares. The truth of Carrington House was a secret buried deep, beneath layers of whispers, blood, and shadow. A secret that had begun more than a century ago, when the first stone was laid, when the first walls were raised, and when something was summoned that should have remained buried forever. The history of the house was never written in books, never told in the whispers that passed through the town, warning those who dared to get too close. But the truth, it was far worse than the ghost stories that echoed through the ages. The Carrington family had been cursed from the start. Edward Carrington, the patriarch, was a man of wealth and ambition, but also of darkness. In his lust for power and immortality, he had turned to forbidden practices, rituals that delved into the occult, into realms where humanity had no business treading. He believed he could command forces older than time itself, forces that could grant him eternal life, endless power. But instead, he invited something else into the world, something malevolent. What Edward summoned that night, deep in the bowels of the house, in a chamber far below the earth, was not just a spirit, not just a ghost. It was an entity, a being from the abyss. And once it had been called forth, it could not be controlled. It bound itself to the house, feeding on the fear and souls of those who dared enter, growing stronger with each victim it consumed. Edward and his family were the first to fall. One by one they vanished, their bodies never found. Their souls became the foundation on which the entity built its prison, a place where it could exist between worlds, drawing more and more into its web. Over the years, the house changed hands many times, each new owner meeting a fate more terrible than the last. The house called to them, whispered to them, luring them into its grasp, and when they entered, they never left. Sarah had never stood a chance. As the house shifted in the aftermath of Sarah's demise, the walls groaned in satisfaction, the darkness settling once more into a quiet, insidious peace. The entity had what it wanted, for now, but outside in the cold night, someone watched. Clara stood on the other side of the iron gate, her breath coming in short, panicked bursts as she stared up at the dark silhouette of Carrington House. Her phone still clutched in her hand, the last message from Sarah burned into her mind. Sarah had been inside for too long. Far too long. Clara had hesitated, not wanting to believe the frantic texts Sarah had sent just hours earlier. The stories about the house had always felt exaggerated, nothing more than old myths designed to scare children. But now, standing here, looking up at the house that seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. She understood. This place was wrong. So wrong. She took a step forward, the wind biting at her skin, whispering through the dead branches of the trees that surrounded the estate. The gate creaked as she pushed it open, the sound loud and jarring in the stillness of the night. Her gut twisted with a mixture of fear and determination. She had to find Sarah. She couldn't leave her behind. As Clara approached the front steps, the house seemed to shift, to breathe, like it was waiting for her, watching her. The darkness inside beckoned, a void that promised answers but also danger. The front door loomed in front of her, cracked open just enough to reveal the blackness beyond. She hesitated, her heart hammering in her chest. Every instinct told her to turn around, to run, but she couldn't, not without Sarah. Clara's hand trembled as she reached for the door, pushing it open. The house groaned in response, the sound deep and resonant, like the growl of some ancient beast waking from a long slumber. The darkness swallowed her whole. Inside the house, the shadows stirred again. The entity, old and cunning, felt her presence, tasted her fear. It was still hungry, always hungry. The house shifted, its rooms twisting, the corridors lengthening, preparing itself for another victim. But Clara was different. Her fear was tinged with something else, something the house hadn't felt in a long time. Anger, determination, a refusal to succumb to the same fate as the others. The entity watched, waiting. It would toy with her as it had with all the rest. But there was something about Clara, something the house couldn't quite grasp. She wasn't just here to save her friend. She was here to fight. The house would have to play a different game this time. It would have to break her. The shadows crept closer, the whispers beginning again, curling through the darkness, wrapping around Clara's mind. But Clara wasn't afraid. Not yet. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the bones of the old house. The town slept peacefully, unaware of the horrors that stirred in the heart of Carrington House, the new nightmare unfolding behind its walls. The house had taken many souls, and it would take many more. But this time, as Clara ventured deeper into the suffocating darkness, one thing was certain. The truth of Carrington House was far from over. The battle for its soul had only just begun, and the house was ready for war.